Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to look at another mini PC. This one is from Chuwi and it is called the RZBOX. Now this isn't the first RZBOX that they've released, but it is the most recent. And it has an upgraded CPU and a couple other bells and whistles as well. Now they're selling the PC directly on their website for $640 right now. I think that's a sale price. And one unique thing about it is it can be laid horizontally or vertically. As far as chipset, it's running a Ryzen 7 5800H, which is a pretty hefty processor. Here's a quick look at the I/O. We'll go into more detail here in a minute. In terms of specs, I mentioned the CPU already. It's going to have integrated Radeon graphics and some typical mini PC specs beyond that: 4K 60Hz, 512 gigs of storage, 16 gigs of RAM, and it has Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. So in this video, let's run it through its paces. We're going to give it a bunch of PC gaming tests, and then of course spend a lot of time on emulation. And we'll see whether or not it's worth that $640. And so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, it looks like on the box here they have three different models. We're going to do the 5800H like I mentioned before. No surprises inside. You'll have a user manual and some product registration, and it comes with a 90-watt power supply altogether. The power supply isn't the smallest in the world, but I appreciate that it's not just one big brick. So let's take a look at the RZBOX itself. First impressions, this thing is pretty dang hefty. It has aluminum all along the top and the bottom, but all of the sides are made out of plastic. And this is the front here. I kind of like the fact that it has this really boxy industrial look to it. You could almost mistake it for a modem if you just kind of squinted your eyes. And the aluminum is nice and cool to the touch. On the front we have USB 2.0, USB-C, headphone and microphone jacks, and then a power button. Not a lot going on around the rest of the device here. The sides, top and bottom are just kind of all nondescript. But on the back you can see there is an exhaust vent, power plug, and three different video outputs. We have DisplayPort HDMI and RGB. Now this is rocking dual gigabit Ethernet, and then four more USB ports. Two of them are USB 3.0 and the other two are 2.0. Personally, I wish it had more 3.0 ports. In terms of size, this thing is pretty big. Here's the other most recent Chuwi device. This one is called the LarkBox X, and it's about half the price and about half the size too, but I actually kind of like this one. To give you a better idea of size, here it is compared to an Xbox Series controller. And then of course, let's do a comparison with Kerrygold butter. Altogether, I would say this is about 4.5 bricks of butter altogether. Definitely one of the biggest mini PCs I've reviewed to date. So let's plug this thing up and get it on the desk, and this is what it looks like here. And I gotta say, it is pretty big sitting here on my desk like this. I think if I was going to keep this permanently on my desk, I would orient it vertically and probably put it to the right of my speaker here. I think the fact that it's so just kind of wide and flat just takes up more space than it should. I think vertical is the way to go with this. Okay, so now that it's powered on, let's actually take a look inside. We'll just check the properties real quick, and as you can see, yes, it's running that same processor, 16 gigs of RAM, and Windows 10 Home. First thing I like to do when I'm testing out a device is check out its thermal profile. As we can see here, it's running at 45 watts TDP, and under 100% load with all 8 cores of the CPU, I'm surprised to find that it's running at 97 degrees Celsius. That is really hot, probably the hottest I've ever seen in a mini PC. And that temperature really surprised me, especially because it's covered in aluminum. But if you take a deeper dive into the device itself, you can find that the aluminum actually doesn't touch the heatsink on the CPU at all. And the bottom aluminum doesn't touch anything. And ETA Prime did a teardown and saw the exact same thing here. So unfortunately, even though there's a bunch of metal surrounding this device, they're not taking advantage of the thermal profile they could get if they just had the heatsink touching the aluminum as well. Honestly, it looks like it should run a lot cooler than it does. And that's kind of a shame. Now, looking at the specs of the CPU, you can see that it does have a configurable TDP of up to 54 watts, and you might even be able to push that a little bit further too. But given the fact that it got to 97 degrees at 45 watts, I personally do not recommend adjusting that TDP. I think you'll have a lot of issues with thermal throttling. Now, before we get into games, let's do a quick video breakdown. This is running at 4K unscaled, and the video playback is actually really good. It dropped 5 frames right when I pressed play, and then from then on, it was perfect. And what that indicates to me is this could work pretty well as a media consumption device or even a media server using something like Plex. And of course, web browsing and day-to-day use should be just fine with those 16 gigs of RAM. But of course, this is a retro gaming channel, so let's focus on the games. As always, I like to start with PC games. We'll start with the lightweight games and move our way up from there. In general, I like to run everything at 1080p, and then I will do the max settings possible, unless I start to see slowdown, and then I'll start ratcheting it back. But for a lot of these lighter end games, there is no ability to change the graphics profile, these are just all of the default settings. But as you can see, they're all running pretty well. Moving on to 3D based games, for example Minecraft here. It didn't run at a stable 60 frames per second, but it hovered between 50 and 60 the whole time, and I would say the gameplay is relatively smooth. Unfortunately, I was not able to catch this rabbit. Now moving along, Hades actually unfortunately did not run at full 60 frames per second. The dip in frame rates didn't slow down the gameplay, but it did make it a little less smooth. Now, Counter-Strike Go ran at an average of about 45 to 50 frames per second, and to me, for a competitive shooter like this is completely unplayable. It was so bad that I even got killed by a bot. Moving over to Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I used the medium or balance settings here, and anytime I got into any sort of combat, it would drop down to about 53 frames per second. And the dip in frame rate did make it stutter every once in a while. Tunic at the very lowest settings got about 40 frames per second, and honestly the gameplay was still quite smooth, not too bad. But I was surprised to find that the integrated graphics on this would max out more quickly than I thought. As you can see, even with Sonic and All-Star Racings, it's at 99% on the GPU specs up above. So by far, when it comes to this gaming performance, we're getting limited by the GPU. And honestly, for a PC and CPU as expensive as this, I wasn't expecting this bad of performance. Even at the lowest settings for Halo Reach, we're getting about 52 frames per second. And the only way that I could play Street Fighter V was using low spec mode with low settings at 900p, and it kind of looked just terrible. So overall, the PC gaming performance was worse than I expected, especially for $640. So now let's move over to emulation, and I'm going to run RetroArch for most of these retro systems here, and as you can expect, things like Nintendo and Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, these all just played perfectly, to the point where I could use some of those harder emulators. For example, with Super Nintendo, I used the BSNES core. So I think overall when it comes to these retro 2D systems, no problem here. And that's exactly what I would expect from a mini PC. Now when it came to systems capable of 3D graphics, I tended to upscale the graphics as much as I could, at least up to 1080p. And so as you can see here with PS1, we're running at 1080p using the Swan Station core, and while I was seeing some accuracy issues when it came to the sprites and the menus and stuff, overall it was playing fine. Moving over to arcade games, I typically just tried to test the high-end games, so as you can see Killer Instinct 1 plays fine, same thing with Killer Instinct 2. And same thing with Tekken. I wouldn't buy this exclusively to use an arcade cabinet, but it can play arcade rather well. Moving back to home console systems, here's Sega Saturn. I'm using the Beetle core here, which is more accurate, but unfortunately doesn't upscale, but I kinda like it this way. And as you can see, it's running just fine, 60 frames per second with both Daytona USA and Die Hard Arcade. Nintendo 64 I did upscale to 1080p, and it's running just fine, both with F-Zero X, which is one of the harder games to play on the system, and same deal with Conker's Bad Fur Day. So let's keep going with these RetroArch systems. The last one here is going to be Dreamcast. We're running this also at 1080p with the widescreen hack, and every game that I threw at it played at 1080p, no problem at all. So now let's jump into the standalone emulators. We'll start with PSP. This one I'm also upscaling to 1080p, and it's running at 60 frames no problem. In fact, God of War Chains of Olympus plays at 1080p just fine too. So this is a really great PSP machine. And surprisingly, GameCube was really good too. I kept everything at just a stable 1080p and everything I threw at it was just fine. F-Zero GX, super hard to play, was just great. Same thing with LEGO Star Wars, the original trilogy. So yeah, 1080p GameCube on this little mini PC is just fine. In fact, I think you're probably going to be able to upscale it up to 4K for some games if you have a monitor that supports it. PS2 was a little bit more of a mixed bag. You know, most games played at 720p no problem, and quite a few actually could be upscaled to 1080p and still run rather well. Ratchet & Clank is a good example. This one I didn't expect to be able to play at 1080p based on what I've been playing before, but it was actually pretty good.
Messages by pressing the triangle button. To disable text messages, please select options from your
But of course, not every game's going to play great. For example, God of War at 720p still had a lot of hiccups. But if I busted it all the way down to just the native resolution, you know, like how we actually used to play it back in the day, it was fine. When it comes to original Xbox emulation, this one was pretty good too. I kept everything at a native resolution, but both Soul Calibur 2 and Halo played at full speed. To me, that indicates that about 75% of games are going to play well, as long as they're compatible with the emulator. Moving up to Wii U, I kept this one at native resolution as well, and this is where things started to get a little bit hairy. For example, Super Mario 3D World almost always plays really well, but this one was pretty sluggish. And Mario Kart 8 was unfortunately really slow and had a lot of stutters too. And so I was curious to try out Breath of the Wild, and unfortunately this one is completely unplayable. I was averaging about 10 frames per second, and this was just really not fun to play. And unfortunately it doesn't get better from there. I tried out PS3 just running native resolution here with Prince of Persia, and it ran at about 2/3 speed. So to me this is a clear indication this machine is not going to be capable of PS3 gameplay. And sadly, Nintendo Switch actually struggled on this as well. I tried all sorts of things. I tried it docked and undocked. I tried it with OpenGL and Vulkan backends. And surprisingly, only the OpenGL backend actually worked. If I switched it over to Vulkan, it would just crash on me. I actually had no ability to play Vulkan with Yuzu at all. And I thought maybe this is a driver compatibility issue, but I do think something else is going on. We'll check on this later. But first, we're going to try out Batocera. So I've plugged in my flash drive, and then I went into the BIOS by pressing delete when I booted up the system. And then I changed my boot options to be the USB drive instead of the Windows Boot Manager. What that means is anytime I plug in a bootable flash drive, it'll boot the drive instead of through Windows. And so that's how I was able to get Batocera up and running on this device. And I've done a lot of videos about Batocera, especially that flash drive, and so I'm not going to get into a ton of details, but I will say that I just really like this environment here. It allows me to focus on the games, and then I can store everything on the flash drive itself. So let's do a little bit of quick testing here just to make sure everything works okay. We'll start with GameCube, and Mario Kart Double Dash works just fine. And this is upscaled to 1080p here, no problems. And Nintendo Wii was actually pretty good too. I tried one of the harder games here, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, and other than when I tried to do like a really big move, which would always kind of slow things down, the general gameplay was just fine. So I think that means that Wii is going to be pretty good on this too. I did want to try a couple other systems out, so for example I tried PS2, and this one did run at 60 frames per second with God of War, but only in the native resolution. It really just kind of chugged at 720p, worse than it did on Windows. But other games played fine. Here's another look at Ratchet & Clank running at 1080p. This one did slow down, sometimes down to like say 54, 52 frames per second, but that's pretty good performance for 1080p using OpenGL on Linux. And so I was surprised to find that PS2 wasn't that much worse than it was on Windows. And here's the weird one for me, Wii U actually played better on Linux than it did on Windows. Super Mario 3D World, which had some slowdowns in the Windows side, actually played at full speed. At least I think it did. Unfortunately, I don't have any way of seeing the frames per second here with Wii U. And so this might be like a see no evil kind of thing, but all the same, Mario Kart 8 and Super Mario 3D World played really smoothly. A lot better than they did on Windows. And so I had a hunch about this device, especially because I thought the performance was worse than I was expecting. So I opened it up here in the bottom, and yeah, sure enough, it's running single channel RAM. I mean, it's kind of cool they put a 16GB stick in here, even if it is a generic RAM brand. But that's not what you're supposed to do with Ryzen CPUs. At the very least, this should have been dual channel with 2 different 8GB sticks. And this is why we're having that big bottleneck with the GPU, because the GPU relies on the RAM to basically spread out the workload, and it needs dual channel RAM in order to do that. And so unfortunately, they've kind of crippled this machine on their own by using single channel RAM. By the way, the other slot here is the 2 M.2 slot. So you can see that it has the 1 hard drive slot here, and there's another one open in case you wanted to add your own storage. So yeah, I think when it comes to the performance, the reason why we were seeing kind of bad PC gaming performance as well as those high-end emulators has to do with the lack of dual channel RAM here. And so I think at this point, we've probably seen enough about this device. Let's go ahead and jump into what I like and what I don't like about the RZBOX. To start, what I like is the industrial design. It looks kind of cool, and I do like it when it's actually vertically oriented. I also like the fact that it has 3 different video out options. It gives you a lot of versatility when it comes to plugging in this mini PC into random displays. And I was surprised to see that Batocera performance was better than on Windows. I'm not sure what optimizations were running there, but Wii U was a lot better. So if you have this and you want to play Wii U, I would do it on Batocera. Everything else was about on par with Windows, but of course I love that Batocera navigation experience. Now let's talk about what I don't like. Number 1, this thing's pretty dang big. Honestly, I don't think I would ever set it down horizontally, but thankfully you can put it up vertically and it does hide some of that size. The thermal performance on this was pretty disappointing. I was really surprised to see it go up to 97 degrees Celsius just from a standard torture test. Because unfortunately that means that I'm not comfortable with configuring the TDP to get better performance. And it's a little frustrating that they have so much metal on this device and they're not taking advantage of that. But of course, probably the biggest blunder here is that single channel RAM. It's just kind of a shame and something that I wasn't expecting at all. So I do think that you probably could get better performance in the long run, but you would have to add your own dual channel RAM. And to me, that kind of defeats the purpose of having a mini PC in the first place. These things are supposed to be relatively plug and play. So it makes no sense to buy something with 16 gigs of RAM, knowing full well that you're going to have to upgrade it anyway. And as we saw, the CPU performance in terms of gaming and everything else was a little underwhelming. And I would say that a lot of that has to do with these 2 big missteps, the thermal performance and the single channel RAM. So at the end of the day, do I recommend this mini PC for $640? And I think you know what I'm going to say, and that's going to be, unfortunately, no. Despite the fact that it has some pretty good I/O, I think there's just enough missteps here that there are other mini PC options out there, including ones from Chuwi themselves, that are probably a better buy. So what I encourage you to do is check out my mini PC playlist, and you can see various PCs there at various different price points, so you can get a better idea of the value for your money. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.